Who are Andy Larsen's top targets for the Utah Jazz to draft in the 2024 NBA Draft? And are there any trades on the horizon? Find out next on Locked On Jazz.
You are Locked On Jazz, your daily podcast on the Utah Jazz. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome into Locked On Jazz. I'm Leif Thulin. I'm excited to be back with you guys hosting for the next 2 weeks in stay of David Locke on Locked On Jazz. I'm a lifelong Jazz fan who's a credentialed NBA draft analyst, attendee of the 2023 NBA Draft Combine, and soon to be attendee of the 2024 Combine. I also worked as a Jazz broadcast assistant and statistician the past 3 years, and I will give you a unique perspective all offseason long about the NBA Draft, because I love college basketball just like I love the NBA. So I'll have you covered. And I'm excited today to be joined by Andy Larsen of the Salt Lake Tribune. But we're going to talk about the NBA draft as well as some trade rumors and kind of go through our varying perspectives and talk over the possibilities for the Utah Jazz, who we both adore. Thank you guys for making Locked On Jazz your first listen every day. And remember, Locked On Jazz is free and available on all platforms, including YouTube at Locked On Jazz, where the best way to help us grow is comment anything below. And today's question is, who do you want the Jazz to take of the guys Andy and I discuss? Thank you to FanDuel for sponsoring it, and thank you to Andy Larsen for hopping in. Thank you, Andy. How are you?
I'm good, man. How are you?
Doing well. I'm excited to talk about the draft, about the Utah Jazz, as I typically am. But I'm excited for this episode in particular because I unintentionally teased some of our first segment where we're going to talk about the Jazz trade deadline. I mean, and Danny Ainge said there's going to be big game hunting. And so I made a little bit of a wordplay and said, what if Giannis is the guy? Is it Devin Booker? Is it Brandon Ingram? And I'm excited to hear from someone who's a little more plugged in with sources than I am, how feasible these things are for the Utah Jazz to make these trades that could fast track the franchise to contention. That's the first segment. In the second segment, Andy and I are going to go over his favorite guards, who could be the options for the Jazz, whether it's the top 4 or 8 or 9. Those are the most likely percentage places the Jazz could draft. And then the final segment, we'll discuss the wings and or bigs that Andy has linked to the Utah Jazz, and we'll go through their games a little bit as well, just familiarize you guys with the players that could be on the Jazz. So let's dive right in. Like I mentioned in the outline there, I did an episode the other day, and so the everydayers, thank you guys for listening, where I could envision the Jazz hunting for the big game with Giannis as the top priority, Devin Booker as the second highest commodity, Brandon Ingram as maybe the third highest attraction. And I also listed that trading for Giannis might deplete the franchise. Booker would really cost a lot of picks, even if not Markin, which I'm sure would be the first asking price. And then there's Brandon Ingram, who you saw have a rough playoff series. Does that move Jazz fans? So I'm going to ask you some of those same questions. And where do the Jazz turn if it's not those guys? Does any of that stick out to you to that you want to bite off and say this is possible, this is impossible?
Yeah, look, I just don't see the indications right now that Giannis and Devin Booker are really truly on the market. And yes, the Milwaukee Bucks and Phoenix Suns lost in the first round in disappointing fashion. I think the Bucks can excuse that a little bit given the injuries they had, including Giannis, and will probably want to push forward. Phoenix, I think is on paper is in a better place to sell, but they have been so publicly in support of bringing everyone back, and then giving it another go. And I honestly think that makes some sense given, their lack of draft assets and their lack of ability to, even if they do trade Devin Booker and Kevin Durant and blah, 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 where are they as a franchise? How long does it take them to compete again? So to me, I don't actually see those guys as truly on the market. I don't think that they are really having conversations about Giannis and Devin Booker, which means that, yeah, you are talking about kind of that next tier of stars that, are significantly worse. You're not getting a top 10 player and maybe a top 15 player, but you're probably getting a top 25 player or top 30 player if you're really talking about the Jazz going out and acquiring someone this year.
Yeah, and I prefaced it with saying I don't think Giannis plays for another team other than the Milwaukee Bucks in his career. I think Devin Booker would take an absolute haul, and I had 5 first-round draft picks, Colin Sexton and John Collins, so it was unlikely, and I was fully aware of that. Now, the question that I ended up asking at the end of that episode is one I'll pose to you. If the Jazz were to go for these guys, do you think fast tracking by getting a Brandon Ingram, or even if somehow the Devin Booker were to happen, which I agree with you, seems unlikely, if you fast track by getting one of those stars, who's a peripheral star, in Booker's case, he's probably top 15, Ingram probably top 30. Does fast tracking by getting one of those guys to pair with Lowry Markkanen, but losing some of those assets, actually make the Jazz more of a contender? Or does kind of stacking your cards in the draft, playing the percentages of eventually we've got to hit on someone and get yourself your star, which one's more likely to lead the Jazz to contention? Because the more I thought about it, the more I thought about the latter.
Look, yeah, I think it depends on the quality of the star, but to me, Brandon Ingram is a 7-win player right now, and I think Devin Booker is a 12-win player, and Giannis might be a 13 to 15-win player. You know what I mean? Like, these are you're talking about a very different level of wins, and so if you add 12 to 15 wins to the Utah Jazz, then yeah, sure, all of a sudden you are in the Western Conference playoff picture. Maybe you add other talent, and you can kind of see it coalesce into a 55-win team if you can add in free agency and bring in another star, or what have you, right? Like, I don't think that the likes of a Brandon Ingram move the needle in a significant way. And we have to remember that the Jazz were not a playoff team last year, but we're 10 wins out of the Houston Rockets, who were also not a playoff team. You know what I mean? Like, so if you're adding just a 7-win player in Brandon Ingram, it doesn't matter. You're still the 12th seed in the Western Conference, and you're ultimately not all that competitive. And you can say, yes, the Jazz tanked at the end of the year. Maybe you can find 3 wins somewhere and get to the play-in tournament. That's a bad way to build a team, and I think you and I both think that. So if you are talking about Brandon Ingram, and it's one of my least favorite stars in the league, just to be transparent about it, I think you have to add multiple of those guys. You have to add Brandon Ingram and DeJounte Murray, let's say, another kind of 7-win-ish guy. But then even then, again, you're kind of at the bottom of the Western Conference playoff picture, not at the top of it. And you worry about capping yourself out in kind of a Chicago Bulls kind of way.
I'm with you right there. I said in a previous podcast, so every dares, if you're listening, this may be slightly redundant, but new for a lot of you, and I think factually important to understand, is the Jazz in the past 2 seasons have had 1 foot forward, 1 foot backward. And in order to truly contend, you need to have both feet in one place. It can be backwards and 2 foot firmly stepping back and saying, well, we're not going to be great. And that lands you. Maybe you get Victor Wembanyama. Maybe you would have gotten Brandon Miller. Scoot Henderson obviously hasn't looked great so far, but he was that type of allure. And you need a chance at one of those guys. This upcoming year, the Jazz, in terms of the draft, there aren't that many players that really move the needle as superstars, like Wembanyama was the obvious appeal. But the same direction, like the Jazz started off terribly, and then they switched the rotation, and they ended up 500 through 50 games, more or less. And so then you became this team that didn't compete. But it made more sense to be that team that didn't compete. So I echo what Andy's saying there. So the final question I'll ask you in this segment is, what players do you think the Jazz fans should be thinking about that Danny Ainge hints with big game hunting, but maybe it isn't all that big game? What players do you think are actually on the market for the Jazz to try to get?
Yeah, I think you look at Atlanta, especially does, I think, legitimately want to make moves. And I think you could get a Trae Young if you want. I think you could get a DeJounte Murray. I don't think they'll trade both of those guys, but probably one of them to edit that backcourt. And I think, maybe you can make a case for getting them, say, a Colin Sexton or a Jordan Clarkson, and having it change the look and feel of their backcourt to potentially be more productive, especially if you can give them a secondary supportive front court player, whether that be a Walker Kessler or John Collins or something like that, to help them out. I think there are kind of trade paths there. I do think, Brandon Ingram and CJ McCollum could be on the market if you want those guys. Again, I don't think it really does cost 3 first-round picks to get those players unless there is significant competition in the market. And we'll see, for example, what the Lakers do and whether or not they'd be willing to buy, BI or someone like that for that price. But, I think those guys could be available. But, both Danny Ainge and Justin Zanuck talked about it at the trade deadline. that they were hoping for kind of chaos in the playoffs. And we've seen that chaos occur. We saw the Warriors out early, Suns, Lakers. I mean, some of these star-laden teams, Pelicans, out early, but they all have kind of said, and it may make the most sense for them to just try to continue to build off of their thing rather than kind of sell like the Jazz did 2 years ago. So to me, that's what I'm seeing in the marketplace. And until can I hear differently, until we see these teams actually look to sell their players, then I kind of believe that the pickings are going to be slim a little bit.
Yeah, and that's kind of what I tried to outline, is that if you were to mortgage a lot of your franchise for superstars, you end up with a bit of a barren cupboard in terms of your assets along with the rest of the team. Like the Suns had 3 stars, but they only really had six useful players. And so they let themselves in a vulnerable spot, and they lost. So I think the Jazz need to grow this organically, and after picking hopefully the players that can alter the course of the franchise, then you can build through the trade as you have a more clear direction. Well, we're going to talk about those players coming up next. Andy and I will discuss the best guards in the draft, how he likes the fits for the Jazz, or maybe we'll talk about some best player available versus fit, which I'm going to do an episode on later this week. But first, let me tell you guys about BetterHelp. Sometimes we all need the opportunity to get something off our chest, big or small, certain things that can really start to get to you. It's important to let that out, especially to someone who's unbiased on your life. For example, I can tell you how I really and truly feel about who the Jazz should draft. But sometimes that's not all that is on one's mind, and you still need a kind, unbiased audience all the same. Therapy can be different for everyone. Most of us have bigger problems than our favorite sports team, and it's important to get things off your chest every once in a while. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be flexible and suited to your schedule. So visit betterhelp.com/LockedOnNBA to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/LockedOnNBA. I also want to let you guys know about Murdoch Hyundai. Murdochs have been in Utah for over 80 years, and Hyundai is the best car for your money. Safety features, bells, whistles, all in amazing cars for amazing prices. The SUV lineup features the Kona, the Tucson, the Santa Fe, the Palisade, and as I've told you guys the last few times, I've been driving the Tucson recently and love it. And I have the keys in my pocket right now. It's got all the bells and whistles. If you're turning lanes and someone's oncoming, it beeps when you reverse. It lets everyone around you know. It's got the beeping when you reverse, tells you who's nearby, and it even tells you when you're at the stoplight and maybe you're looking at directions. And it says, "Oh, the car in front of you started to leave," and so it's got everything up to the nines. The Ioniq 5 also is in the slate of cars that Murdoch's selling right now. It was electric and named the Motor Trend SUV of the Year by Motor Trend. And then the new Ioniq 6 is even better. It's amazing. Electric, looks just like a Porsche, and won the World Car of the Year. There are 3 locations: Linden, Murray, and Logan. And I went to the one in Murray, and they were awesome. And one of the guys even recognized me and said, "Are you Leif from Locked On Jazz?" And I was like, "Wow, I can't believe you saw me there." So whoever that is, thank you. And I'm sure the people at the other locations for Murdoch Hyundai are equally as amazing. So please go to Murdoch and tell them we sent you in. All righty, welcome back into Locked On Jazz, and I'm Leif Thulin, but also let me ask you guys a question. Are you guys watching the playoffs on Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day, and then you have to turn down the volume with all that shouting? Make sure to make the switch to Locked On Sports Today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel program for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So Leif Thulin back here with you, along with Andy Larsen of the Salt Lake Tribune, kind enough to join me. And we were talking about some trade targets, and we ultimately said that the market might be slim pickings. So what does that mean? The Jazz will have to draft well. So who are the guards, Andy, that kind of move you at all, whether it be fit or just the players that you've seen so far that you enjoy? Which guys stand out in the 2024 NBA draft class?
Yeah, look, I think you have to preface it by saying that, like the trade market, maybe that the draft is a little bit of slim pickings, and these aren't game-changing players. What you're probably hoping for in the draft is a talented, is a starter level player at kind of best in this top 10, or a talented role player, right? But you're not looking for at least to me, I don't think you're getting a all-star in this draft. I don't think you're getting an all-NBA player in this draft. Maybe 1 or 2 of these guys do turn out to be all-stars, but it's going to be kind of a unlikely bounce in their game that's going to provide that, right? So, I think kind of with that being said, I kind of think about these guys and how they can fit in their first couple of years as role players and kind of grow from there. With that, honestly, I do like Stephon Castle a little bit, despite the inability to shoot, which is pretty unusual for me, given how much of emphasis I put on shooting as I evaluate prospects. But I think he's not broken with his jump shot, right? Like I do think that it doesn't go in right now. I do think that it can go in with a couple of years of work. I don't think it's a hugely unfixable problem. The free throws concern me, to be sure, but because he is such a talented defender, such a talented passer, and such a talented, just a smart player that you can kind of, I think, put in a lineup pretty quickly and he'll understand what's going on. I like what he can bring. Being 6'6", did improve the shooting over the course of last year, which makes me, pretty confident or feel better about it. Maybe not fully confident, but kind of has a couple of outs there, I think, as a successful role player. Go ahead.
Oh, yeah. Well, the only thing I would add to that is Castle has a lot of fans saying, well, UConn was so good, he didn't get to maximize his talent. And I'll play a little devil's advocate because I think that's also true. What if UConn was so good they maximized their players and Castle is the guy that you saw in terms of, wow, he was really efficient attacking the rim. He was a really good passer and he's the defender. I'm not going to argue anything about the defense, but what if that's the role best suited to him and it's just kind of theoretical or projection to say that he can handle the ball at the NBA level? So that's my only pause for concern. But I will say, while I'm typically not a draft for fit guy, I'm typically best player available. And that's not to say he may not be. He very well could be at 8 should the Jazz draft there. But does Keon George factor into your analysis of which guards stick for the Jazz, or does Danny Ainge saying, well, we don't know if he's our franchise point guard, he can play the point guard or the shooting guard matter more? Because I tend to lean that way, and based off your reaction there, I assume you're with me on that.
Yeah. Look, I mean, it's just even if Keon George was lottery marketing good, I still am looking for a best player available by far and value, and because the difference between good players and mid players in the draft is really, really substantial. And so I think even regardless of Keontae having a spot in your hopeful backcourt of the future, you have to acknowledge that, first of all, there's a real chance that Keontae's inefficiency could be a problem throughout his career, and maybe he isn't a player that you want to start. He could be a future sixth man, and that has to be okay. And then even if you do have kind of two talented point guards in your backcourt, I think that's fine for now, and then you figure it out later. I think you pull a Cleveland, and you've got Darius Garland and Colin Sexton in your backcourt, and you make changes as you see fit. So, but I don't think that you draft with that in mind, because again, just the difference between the best players in any given top 10 and the mid-level best players in any top 10 is so significant.
I'm right there with you. And that's the only reason I wanted to ask that, because Castle's kind of the one that Jazz fans project next to Keontae because of his sizable, like he can play the 1 or the 2 and he's big. So are there any other guards that stand out to you that you have a kind of a preferential view on in the preliminary looks at these players as the draft is still a month and a half away?
Yeah, look, I feel that kind of size question, regardless of whether or not you imagine them next to Keon George, because I think there is something to be said that if you are drafting what you consider to be a role player or complementary starter rather than a, Jalen Brunson-esque scorer, I do think it's important for that player to be tall and big, and because you want the defense, you want the playmaking thing, and David Locke's been really great on kind of talking about the importance of size in the NBA in the last couple of years, especially kind of at those playmaking positions. And then you look around the league right now, and you do have Jalen Brunson, Donovan Mitchell, Darius Garland, kind of these smaller guards excelling, but in a different way as scorers, maybe rather than playmakers. And so, if you look at a Rob Dillingham, for example, I believe he can score. I believe he can get buckets. It's a question on kind of how efficient that's going to be at the NBA level. I might look towards more a Reed Shepherd and see where kind of, again, those role player skills can take you. And in general, I prefer role players who are better at defending and passing and catch and shoot, frankly, like Reed Shepherd is. Where, Rob Dillingham can shoot, but it's the defense questions are as big as they get, as big as I can remember a top 10 prospect. So I guess I didn't name one guy in particular there, but I also look at Nikola Topic as a guy who, again, you're questioning the shot for sure, but being that big, being able to create because he is 6'6", and be able to get downhill, I think is something he can excel at. And then, frankly, he's a year younger than most of these guys. I give a lot of credence to that as well.
I generally agree with everything you said because I don't believe there are really stars in this class. And my philosophy is if you're in the top 5 of a draft class, and I know the Jazz could very well be at 8, 9, 10, but they also have a 26% chance of being in the top 4, that you typically want to draft someone that can accelerate your franchise into the postseason. Like an example of this is I was firmly beating the drum of Banchero over Jabari Smith Jr. because I thought he could be the number 1, whereas Jabari Smith Jr. projected as a defensively oriented Rashard Lewis. And so far, I've been proven right on that. I've missed on other ones. But I will say this year, it's harder to think that way because of those guys you just mentioned, I think that Rob Dillingham's got a really good chance of being an all-star. If anyone of those guys is, I'd say he's the most likely because he could be like a watered-down Trae Young in the sense that you could put the ball into his hands and he could run pick and roll and score. But I don't know how much you value Trae Young right now. As we talked about at the beginning, his type of player isn't as prioritized right now, even if he gives you 20. I think he's kind of Trae Young stylistically, not quite as talented, but effectiveness of Darius Garland. And right now you're seeing Darius Garland have a success, but not to the level of being a franchise player. And so I'm with you. Maybe you do prioritize the guards that are complementary. So it's a philosophical thing. And I wonder if size will end up being the thing because Danny Ainge typically has picked bigger players.
Yeah, I was going to mention that as well. And I do think that's important to remember. Now, maybe that changes this draft. And I think there are exceptions, obviously. But agreed. I think his penchant for bigger players could be a part of this. And then, honestly, we'll talk about the front court players coming up. But there's also the trade possibility, right? Like you don't have to take the selection if you don't like someone here. If you can kick it down the road to a stronger draft and there's a team willing to do that, there's some logic to that too.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. And then you led me nicely into the segue here. So coming up next, we will talk about the many sizable wings that this draft, though there's lacking in star power, there are many sizable wings that could fit into the way that Danny Ainge typically picks. And we'll discuss which ones Andy prefers. But first, a word from DoorDash. Want to make mom smile? Start Mother's Day with flowers or surprise her with gifts from brands that she loves, delivered with the very same day with DoorDash. DoorDash is more than just a great food delivery that you've come to love. For instance, does mom have a sweet tooth? Is she a tech enthusiast, a beauty connoisseur, or is she outdoorsy? No matter what she's into, you can make her smile with a fruit or flower bouquet, makeup, tech gear, workout gear, and more. Shop with savings that would make her proud with a Dash Pass membership. You'll save with a $0 delivery fee and reduced service fees on eligible orders from Dash Pass. Merchants that meet the minimum subtotal and other fees, including the service fee, do apply. And the terms apply. But to get all of your Mother's Day gifts all in one place, get 50% off of your next order, up to $15 when you spend $15 or more on your next flower convenience, grocery, or retail order now with code LOCKEDONNBA. That's LOCKEDONNBA. Order using DoorDash. Terms apply. Well, welcome back to Locked On Jazz. I'm Leif Thulin. I'm joined by Andy Larsen of the Salt Lake Tribune. And we talked about our favorite guards and who fits with the Jazz. And now we're going to talk about the many wings. There are many of them. Who's going to pan out? That's going to be a real question this year because no one really sticks out as that guy has star power. And then there's a lot of good traits that some of these guards have or wings have. Cody Williams, Matas Buzelis, Ron Holland, but many of them have glaring deficiencies as well. So I'll pose it to you this way. Is there any of that trio or elsewhere that you think is more alluring to the Jazz, whether they're picking the top 4 or at 8 or 9 than the others? And what would be the reason for that?
Yeah, I do like Buzelis, and he's someone I saw at last year at the All-Star game in Salt Lake City, the NBA camp there, where they bring all in the international prospects all in, and where Buzelis started to get some kind of number one buzz. I see it. I see him as a useful role wing player, thanks to good shooting upside. I think he can. It's got good feel for the game, which I love. Right, like you can imagine him as a connector, as a play finisher. I think he's decent at driving the rim. He's not great at finishing at the rim, and I think obviously that's something that can really improve. But look, he's 6'11" and can drive and shoot and finish. Like I think there's a lot there that I feel more confident in that turning into something than the guards we talked about necessarily turning into something. So I think he'd be my number one wing guy. I do like Cody Williams. I don't think he's a star soon. I don't know that he's going to have the scoring skill set to score 20 or, to even be, what his brother is, Jalen Williams, which is, one of the best players in the Western Conference right now, frankly. That being said, I do think that there is some stuff there where, he's a little taller than Jalen Williams. I think he's smart and with the way he defends. Not the best athlete in the world, but I do think that is okay in today's NBA. I'd rather have someone who can play than who's a terrific athlete. And I do think he's a smart defender. I think he can shoot a little bit. I think the mechanics are there where he can improve on that. So to me, those are my two favorite players in the wing draft, kind of wing class, I should say. I guess I would also point out I did see Ron Holland play the Salt Lake City Stars this year in probably his worst game as a player ever, when he had 11 turnovers. I do think the body is there, but he's not as tall as you would hope, as those other two guys are, as that I mentioned. And I kind of worry about even if he does kind of succeed to some level, I worry that it's kind of RJ Barrett-y, where ultimately, the ball's in his hands, and he can get off some tough shots, and ultimately, like you're just making only 40% of them and not adding a lot of wins and efficiency to your team. And I think, again, I'm looking at these guys as probably likely role players moving forward, and I see real clear paths for those first two guys, and less so on the Ron Holland side of things.
Yeah, I generally agree. I actually compared in my big board, which I'm working on and soon to publish. I have RJ Barrett as the comparison for Ron Holland, so I'm right there of the same mindset. The one thing I would push back on in terms of Holland is I think that the way that he scores is something that could be implemented in the NBA, attacking closeouts. If you're to look at like pros and cons entering the season, you'd say, well, Holland's a deficient shooter, and he has been, but he shot better than Matas Buzelis. And I'm not saying that to discount your take, because I actually agree with everything you said about their ability to fit in with roles. I think Buzelis is more skilled. I think he's got better size for his position. I think Buzelis honestly is like a 6'10" two guard, and Holland's a 6'6" small forward. And I know people subscribe to positionless basketball, but I think that those two guys have carved out niches, and I think Buzelis would be a better role player. I think if one of them were to become an actual star, I think it would be more likely to be Holland, but I just don't think that likelihood is all that likely. And that's where I tend to agree with you in terms of Cody Williams and Buzelis. I think Williams has the best playmaking skills of that trio. Williams, to me, I think is likely to finish the highest of those three, just because I think he's got playmaking. He played alongside veterans. KJ Simpson was an all Pac-12 point guard, and he's a senior. Tristan Da Silva was a fifth-year senior who was likely to be a first-round pick. And I think he was just a little bit tentative on unclear on what his role was at Colorado. And that's where you see that reservation to shoot. Like, he shot 42% from three, yet shooting is considered a deficiency for him just because he didn't shoot that much. So I agree. One that I would toss out would be Zachary Risache. I'm lower than the consensus on him, but if you get someone with the talent and shooting stroke that he has at the size he has, it's hard to argue with how the NBA is trending. Like, a popular comparison would be Michael Porter Jr. I don't think he's that level of shooter. And before Michael Porter Jr. got injured, he wasn't that level of athlete either. But, you're 6'10", you can really shoot the basketball. That's really in vogue right now.
Yeah, he's kind of like the classic small sample 3-point guy, where you're not sure if and especially at the beginning of this draft kind of evaluation, where he set the world on fire at the beginning of the year, and then at the end, in the last couple of months, didn't shoot as well. then wasn't as good of a shooter in 2022, 2023, like previous season. So was that kind of hot streak for real is what we're saying. Is he a 40% three-point shooter or is he a 35% three-point shooter? It's really kind of the question. And if he's 40%, then you love it. And he really is probably Michael Porter Jr. And if he's not, then you talk about the other skills that aren't necessarily there as much. So I'm with you. I like him. I think he can be a lottery player in this class. There was like number one talk for him for a while. I don't see that necessarily. I think I probably believe in the other wing guys more. But again, he's young enough and 19. I think it's going to be, he could develop in a number of different directions. I think he'd be a fine pick, but probably if those other guys on the board, Buzelis and Cody Williams especially are on the board, I would prefer them largely because of their playmaking, decision making, and actually, especially Buzelis' size, which I like.
Those guys are young, like you alluded to. There's one guy that's a bit older. That's Dalton Connect, who came from a junior college, then to Northern Colorado, then to Tennessee, and scored 21 a game. Was the second best player in college basketball behind Zach Edey this year. What do you feel for the Jazz? Do you think he's a candidate to be picked? Should the Jazz draft 8, 9, or 10?
I guess. I mean, I would see him more as a fit with a team that more frequently drafted older college players, which I haven't seen Danny Ainge do and haven't seen Justin Zanuck do. I guess with the exception of Grayson Allen is the last guy I can think of. And, obviously then Dennis Lindsey was still in charge. I think, Dalton, I'm pretty sure Dalton Connect's going to be a useful NBA role player, kind of in that Grayson Allen mold, maybe a little bit better of a defender than Grayson Allen is. But and a little bit more size as well. But I just don't love drafting a college senior and a 23-year-old in the draft, at this point in the draft anyway. I think he's talented and I think it's good and useful, but I just think that the analytics are so in favor of considering youth when you're making these choices that I think getting someone who's 4 or 5 years older than some of these other players is really significant and something you have to consider and probably ding him on a little bit.
Yeah, I agree there. I think he's the type of player that the Miami Heat, for instance, would be all over after taking Jaime Jaquez, the Warriors, those type of teams. And I guess the last question I have, does the calculus change for drafting a wing fit versus best player available? Is it different than how you would evaluate drafting a guard due to the Jazz's current construction, or is it still same philosophy?
Still same philosophy. Look, I mean, if the Jazz were close, if the Jazz were a contending team, then I think we're having a different conversation. But I could, even if a player were exactly identical to Lauri Markkanen, I would say the Jazz should take that player, right? Like, because you can't have enough of those guys. So I think the Jazz, need size, they need rebounding, they need passing, they need shooting, they need everything. They need creation, they need every basketball skill set you can have. They need, So I think last year there was kind of a question as, would you take someone similar to Walker Kessler, which in this year's draft, would you take as Donovan Clingan, for example? Now that Walker has had the second season that he's had and you're less confident about his ability to, really start and be your bedrock starter for years to come, even like a Clingan is, in my mind, in the realm of possibility because you just don't have enough talent on the roster and you want to take best player available.
I'm with you. I don't think the Jazz are in a position to be worried about redundancy. And even if you are, then you end up, like you said, there's Darius Garland and Colin Sexton. In this case, the Magic are like the example I would point to. There's a ton of guards. And now that they finally have their actual stars in Banchero and Wagner, well, they can choose which guard they want. So that'll do it for Locked On Jazz. Let me ask you guys once more to consider listening to Locked On, because Locked On has launched their first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube. And now it's also available on Amazon Fire TV and the free Fire TV channels app. Locked On Sports Today is here for you 24/7, covering the top sports stories of the day with local experts of Locked On, plus our national shows covering every league. Find Locked On Sports Today, now available on the free Fire TV channels app. Well, thank you guys for listening to Locked On Jazz. With your next listen, tune into Locked On NBA for more playoff coverage. And thank you to Andy Larsen for hopping on. Appreciate your insight, and hopefully we'll catch up more as the draft becomes closer.
Sounds good. Thanks, Leif.
Appreciate it. Thank you guys for listening to Locked On Jazz, and we'll be back with more discussion of best player available versus do you take for fit, and that'll be next time on Locked On Jazz.